Hi everyone, welcome back to another what if scenario video. This episode is going to be what if Gary Moore joined Ozzy Osbourne in 1979. Now, before I begin, this video is going to be dedicated to Gary Moore, who passed away 10 years ago on the 6th of February. So, this one goes to him, one of my favourite guitarists ever. This is the second episode in the series, so if you've not checked the first one out, what if Alex Skolnick joined Megadeth, I'll leave it at the end of the video. And if you're new, subscribe and check out the playlists, and if you go on to like this video, drop it a like and share with people that you think would like my content. Right, let's get into the video now. Let's start with the real timeline of events. Gary Moore, he left Thin Lizzy in 1979 and formed his new band G-Force, but it didn't go too well. They only done one album. And Ozzy Osbourne got fired by Black Sabbath in the same year, and he wanted to make a solo project after that. He asked Gary Moore to be his guitar player, but he declined because he wasn't interested at the time to make another band. He wanted to do a solo career for himself. And he went on to have a pretty good solo career in the 80s and the 90s. He even worked with Ozzy on a track on After the War in 1989. He released a number of albums in the 2000s, and the last one was in 2008 before passing away age 58. Ozzy appointed Randy Rhoads on guitar, and he played on the first two albums before he was tragically killed in a plane accident in 82. And then Jakey Lee played on the next two, and Zakk Wylde played on the next two. Ozzy decided to retire in 1992 or 3. A few years later though, he come back with an album in 95. After that, he's released quite a few albums with multiple guitar players and musicians over the last 20 years, and he hasn't got plans to retire just yet, so fingers crossed he keeps going for a bit longer. The alternate timeline of if Gary Moore joined Ozzy Osbourne. We begin at 1979 when Gary Moore just left Thin Lizzy for the final time, looking to make his own way, making his own solo albums. He moved to LA to sign for Jet Records, and like in real life, he writes and records Dirty Fingers, but it gets shelved in order to make his G-Force band. As he is auditioning band members, he finds out that Ozzy Osbourne had been fired from Black Sabbath, and he's in town also signing for Jet Records. It was suggested by Ozzy's manager at the time, the Ardens, that he appoint Gary Moore as his new guitarist, and Ozzy liked this idea as he somewhat knew him and his guitar capabilities, having heard him in Thin Lizzy and his solo album that he released in 1978. He was somebody that Ozzy would really want to work with, and he saw good chemistry between the two of them. Plus, it made logical sense as they just signed for the same record label. Ozzy would offer the position to Gary. He would offer him a pretty big role contributing to tracks and everything like that. Gary would originally not be interested in working with him, firstly because he wanted to do his own thing and he had a plan for what he wanted G-Force to sound like, which didn't involve Ozzy. Secondly, he was pretty concerned about his lifestyle. At the time, he was drinking and taking drugs a lot. He was pretty much living on alcohol and drugs back then. He was not great to be around. He was not great. Gary would say that he didn't mind helping him audition band members, but he wouldn't want to work with him all the time. I think that Sharon would speak to Gary personally, and he'd tell him that she's doing everything that she can to help Ozzy with his addictions, and that if he come in the next day and have a jam with Ozzy, see if they can change his mind and see if Ozzy is prepared to change what his lifestyle. He would agree, and the day after, him and Ozzy would get on really, really well. They had a brilliant jam session, and Gary would reluctantly agree to join the band. Also, the drummer that Gary was looking to have in his band, Tommy Aldridge, had just joined Ozzy's band as well. So this leaves Gary thinking that he made the right decision in the end. The lineup would be complete with Ozzy's real-life bassist Bob Daisley and keyboardist Don Airey. Now moving on to 1980, they soon started work on the debut album Blizzard of Oz. I think Gary would look at the tracks that he had for Dirty Fingers and suggest they use those as a starter. The rest of the band would think this is a great idea, and they would use quite a lot of material off Dirty Fingers, and they'd use it as the bass. It wouldn't really sound too much like Blizzard of Oz in real life because of Randy's classical influence just wouldn't be there, and Gary has different influences, like more of a blues and Celtic influence. I still think that it would still be a pretty good album and pretty popular among fans, and also quite a lot of people would say that Ozzy had made a success of himself away from Black Sabbath, and Gary's brilliant guitar playing would be highly credited as well. I don't believe it would be as appreciated and as revolutionary as Blizzard of Oz in real life, but I think it would still do pretty good, and then they'll go on tour and start working on the next album. 1981, they released Diary of a Madman. This album hints at Gary's solo sound, maybe like Corridors of Power and Run for Cover in there, but would also have a Black Sabbath-y kind of tone to it as well. Ozzy having a bit more emphasis on what he wants his sound to be like. Probably would have a little bit of a Bark at the Moon sound too. I think the album would do really, really well, and it would put Ozzy at the top of the new wave of British heavy metal that was rising at the time. They would tour for 2 years, and then they'd start working on the next album. In 1982, when they stopped at Florida, that was the place where Randy had his plane crash, or he was in the plane crash. I think Gary would be fine, because I believe that he wouldn't be on the plane in the first place, but I don't think it would still stop the incident happening, and yeah, whoever else was involved would probably still have died, and I think they would take a few weeks off, but then they'd come back and, you know, in honour of those members that they lost. 1983 now, and this is when they released Bark at the Moon. I think this album, they would do a copy and paste of the last one. They would use the same formula, you know, would use his more blues and hard rock opening riffs with mellow choruses, and they'd mix that with some darker, heavier riffs, maybe influenced by Black Sabbath and some heavy metal bands coming through. This probably would be the closest sound-wise to Bark at the Moon, even though I think it would be a much better album, because I'm not a fan of that album in real life. Also, I think Gary would get Phil Lynott to perform on bass for 1 or 2 tracks, because Thin Lizzy at the time had just broke up. And yeah, he thought it'd be cool for him to play on a couple of tracks. But also, Bob Daisley, the relationship between him and the Osbournes was slowly decreasing. I think Daisley would go on to leave the band in 1985 when the Bark tour had finished. 1986. After Daisley left, Ozzy and Gary began working on the next album. Gary would persuade Phil Lynott to play on the album as they're looking for a new bass player. He would agree, and they would release The Ultimate Sin in early 1986. I think he would probably do some vocals on it as well. However, before they released the album, Phil would sadly pass away due to a drug addiction that went way out of control. This would leave Gary feeling absolutely devastated after losing his really good friend. He didn't want the album released so soon after his passing, but Ozzy would say that they'd dedicate the album to him. But I still think Gary would decide to leave the band before they started touring. Ozzy would then appoint rough cut guitarist Jakey Lee to replace him for the tour, and he would also call upon former Sabbath bandmate Geezer Butler to play bass. The album would do pretty well. I think it would sound like The Ultimate Sin in real life, maybe with a mix of Gary Moore's After the War album too. 1987. After this, Gary would have a massive decision to make, whether to rejoin Ozzy or leave to make his own way. I think when the Ultimate Tour was over, Ozzy would go to see him just to basically ask him the question. Gary had made a solo album in this time, Wild Frontier, and he dedicated it to Phil Lynott. And he would also play with Thin Lizzy for some tribute shows as well. After making that album and that playing them gigs, I think he would feel much better and he would decide to rejoin Ozzy for the next album. Now, in 1988, they released No Rest for the Wicked. This album would be a lot darker and heavier than the previous albums, maybe in real life as well. Gary would put more emphasis on his riffs and solos, which the fans would really like. This would again be received highly by the fans and critics. Bob Daisley would return on bass for this album and they'd tour for the next 2 years. 1991. Now, Ozzy would announce that the next album would be his last, as he would decide to retire when the tour was finished. They released No More Tears to great acclaim. Gary would play slightly different on this. I think it would sound a lot like No More Tears, but with a lot more blues elements to it, maybe hinting to what Gary wanted to do after that. It would work really, really well though. And when Ozzy announced his retirement, Gary would be left really surprised. He would think that they're still in their prime and they should keep going as they are. But Ozzy would have none of it, as he wanted to just spend more time with his wife and kids. And when the tour ended, they all went their separate ways. 1993, Gary would release his blues-based album, Still Got the Blues, a few years later than in real life. I think Bob Daisley, Tommy Aldridge and Don Airey would play on that album, though I think over the next few years they would all leave at various points because they would want to play rock and metal stuff rather than blues music all the time. But Gary would carry on with his solo career, making albums, and he would also make his Blues for Greenie covers album. 1994, Ozzy would decide he wants to get a band back together and make another album because he probably got bored. He would appoint Geezer Butler on bass, Randy Castillo on drums, and Rick Wakeman on keyboards. And he would ask Gary Moore if he wanted to rejoin for a third time, but I think this time he would decline as he just wanted to play his blues stuff after that. And he would carry on throughout the 90s making blues albums. This would leave Ozzy a little bit disappointed, but he would understand and respect his decision, and he would go on the hunt for a new guitar player. I think he would be absolutely spoilt for choice with guitarists wanting to join. You know, the short list of names would be of the likes of Alex Skolnick of Testament, Steve Vai, Zakk Wylde of Black Label Society, Jakey Lee, who he'd already worked with, Adrian Smith, formerly of Iron Maiden, Marty Friedman of Megadeth, and possibly Randy Rhoads, as he's still alive in this timeline. Although I think quite a lot of these choices are either too obvious or too unlikely to happen, I think he would appoint Paul Gilbert of Mr. Big to be his new guitar player. Mainly because he plays very similar to Gary Moore, so it would make a lot of sense that way. And also, at the time, Paul's band had just released an album and finished touring, and they were increasingly having a lot of conflicts about the musical direction. So I think that would just make sense for him to want to leave. And also, Paul's a massive fan of Ozzy Osbourne. In the 80s, he auditioned for the band in real life when he was about 17, and he got denied because he was 17. In 1995, Ozzy would release Osmosis to a great success. With Paul at the helm of the writing process, it would not sound like anything that Ozzy had done before, or Osmosis in real life. I think for the better though, because that album wasn't great. It would have the classic Ozzy Sabbath sound mixed with some Mr. Big sounding riffs and melodies, and I think the fans would really like this album. They'd be really happy with the Prince of Darkness's return. And after the tour, I believe Geezer would leave and Rob Trujillo would be appointed to play on bass for the next few years. Now to the 2000s to the present. I think Gary would make another couple of blues albums in the 2000s. He would often play with his old bandmates and for shows, and he would have great relationships with them all. He would see Ozzy a lot and jam with him a few times. Unfortunately, I still think he would pass away like he did, as it was pretty natural, peaceful. This would leave Ozzy pretty upset to lose one of his best friends, but I think he would carry on in his name. Ozzy, I think he would release several albums with Paul Gilbert, Down to Earth a couple of years earlier, maybe like 98, and maybe another one in like 2002. And then I think he would leave after that, wanting to do a solo career for himself, just before Ozzy does his Undercover album. And in real life, he would release a couple more albums with various different people, guitarists and that, all to great success. And in 2013, I think he would reunite with Black Sabbath and record their last album and their last tour. And as for Randy Rhoads, he would never have got the chance to audition for Ozzy Osbourne. He would have been in Quiet Riot, I think, for a few years, and his guitar ability would have gone even better than it was in real life, and he would definitely have been snapped up by somebody like Dio or Iron Maiden or, I don't know, Metallica or something. Or he might even have made his own solo band and done really well out of it. I think he would have hit his ceiling, and he would definitely have been in the top 3 guitarists of all time. Now moving on to my final thoughts. It's just a fanfic, really. It's just, I just like to see how one thing changed from history, how that would change a timeline, and yeah, I'm pretty happy with the timeline that we got, even though it would have been nice to have seen Gary. Would have been nice to have seen Gary play for Ozzy and for Randy Rhoads to live a bit longer. Both of those guitarists are 2 of my favourite ever. They really are. I wanted to do this fanfic for ages. We lost Randy way too soon, and I wanted to give him the opportunity for a longer musical career. He's massively inspired me with his musical background, his classical training. The innovation of Randy changed the way rock sounded, and he pretty much invented neoclassical metal. His talent was unrivaled, and his legacy, I think, will live on forever. Gary Moore, the same. I absolutely love his music from the 80s and the 90s. He changed his sound to blues in the 90s, which is fine. The first album I actually heard of his was Still Got the Blues, and he absolutely blew me away with his guitar playing. He's really inspired my rock and blues playing. And I think he's the most underrated guitarist of all time, and he deserves way more praise than he's got. Another one gone too soon. I would have given everything to have seen him play live, but yeah, I hope that this is a good tribute to him, and I hope he'd be proud of this. So that has been this video. I'd love to know what you thought of this fanfic, if you liked it or not, or anything that you would have changed. I was thinking about having Gary Moore possibly leave a bit earlier in the timeline, but I thought it would be a bit too obvious to do that. And what other rock and metal points in history would you want to see changed? What other what if scenarios would you want to see? Let me know. All feedback is much appreciated, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, keep it metal.